I went to Iraq, to the Mesopotamian wetlands, which was absolutely incredible. There are people living on top of the wetlands in a way that people have been living for 9,000 years. This predates the Sumerian civilization. The Sumerian civilization arose out of this culture after it had been in existence for 3,000 years.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today I'm speaking with Erica Gies. Erica is an award-winning independent journalist who writes about water, climate change, plants, and critters for places like Scientific American, the New York Times, Nature, The Atlantic, The Guardian, National Geographic, and more. She is also the author of the new book, Water Always Wins, Thriving in an Age of Drought and Deluge. A recent story in Nautilus was Why We Need Muck to Fight Rising Sea Levels. Erica, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So to start off, would you mind summarizing your intellectual background a bit, as well as your work as a writer?
Okay, I am a journalist. I've been freelancing for the majority of my 20 or so years in this field. And I've been writing about science and the environment that whole time. I wrote a lot about energy, especially renewable energy. And then about a decade ago, I switched my focus more to water. And it's the kind of subject that just gets more and more fascinating the more you learn about it. And, I grew up in California where water scarcity has long been a concern. And it's something that's just sort of in the air. Everybody is aware of it. Everybody cares about it. And so it was kind of natural for me to focus my work on that.
What drew you to doing writing as a profession?
I love reading, and so I've always been really attracted to reading and writing, wanting to do that myself. And I did get a master's in literature with a focus in eco-criticism, which is an actual thing. But I realized that I didn't want to talk to the ivory tower. It's a really small segment population talking about really specific esoteric things. And I wanted to talk to the wider world, particularly with all of the issues about climate change and stress to the environment.
Mm. Could you give us a brief summary of your story for our viewers who haven't read it yet?
Sure, yeah. The basic idea is that Cisco Bay is a place that was once ringed by tidal marsh wetlands and their neighboring ecosystems. And in the course of settlement by European descent, people of European descent, the wetlands were largely destroyed, about 90% of them. Similarly, there were beaches and shell hash that were also destroyed and replaced with hard engineering. And the effort to restore those systems began about 30 or 40 years ago when people were concerned with flooding and endangered species habitat and more recreation for people. But about, 5 to 10 years ago, people realized that sea level rise is a growing threat. And the tidal marshes actually kind of have a superpower, which is that they can grow vertically and keep up with sea level rise. And the way that they do that is that sediment comes in either upstream from the rivers or from the ocean side in the tides. And that sediment kind of settles down on the marsh plants, and then the marsh plants will die, and their own bodies contribute to the growth, and then new plants grow on top. And so if you give the marshes enough space, time, they can actually keep up with sea level rise and help protect the communities who live behind them.
Can you tell us a bit more how marshes interact and rely on that wider ecosystem to work their best in stemming sea level rise? Like, what's the key factors in making them more resilient?
Yeah, so I mean, every ecosystem kind of before destroyed so many of them leads into the next one. So in this area, there's the mud flat, the low marsh, the mid marsh, the high marsh. Before the mud flat, the eelgrass beds, and then when you get up to the land, you've got something that's called the uplands, which is native plants, and then ultimately oak trees and things like that. And so, in a functioning system, the water is connected from the land down into the sea. And so the creeks are pushing a lot of sediment down off the land, and that sediment helps supply the marshes. And then also, like I said before, tides coming in are depositing that sediment. So we have broken those chains in a few different ways, partly by building development in a lot of areas. In the bay, we've actually filled in parts of the bay, put additional land on the mudflats on the low marsh, and then built things on top of it. And then dams block a lot of the sediment that would otherwise be coming down from the river systems and other infrastructure that people build in rivers to try to control them. And then on the water side, there's also dredging for shipping channels that removes a lot of the sediment. And there have been some kind of counterproductive approaches. So at one point, there was a problem where people were literally dumping garbage into the bay and then using that potentially as fill, or dumping really tainted sediment. And so to try to protect the bay from those insults, the practice became dumping all of this dredge material offshore into the ocean, where it would be distributed and have a less severe local impact. But then what we're experiencing right now really is a sediment shortage. There is not enough dirt coming to these ecosystems from the tides or from upstream because of all these ways in which we are kind of meddling with the system. And so people are trying to change those policies to make more of the sediment available. And there are scientists with a group called the San Francisco Estuary Institute who have done a lot of work in this area and are trying to make people more aware of the importance of sediment for ultimately keeping these communities safe from sea level rise.
Right on. So once again, the title of the book is Water Always Wins. That title reminds me of something that the actor and martial artist Bruce Lee once said about his advice was to be like water, because water could flow and it could crash and it could, take the shape of any vessel it goes into. It's really versatile. So what was your idea, or working with the publisher, what was the idea what you wanted to convey with that title, Water Always Wins?
Well, in the dominant culture, we've really had this idea that we can control water. We're very focused on human needs, and humans are viewed as separate from nature. And so with that, you tend to have kind of single-minded problem solving. So, you need water, build the dam. You're worried about flooding, build a levee. But water is an entity with agency. It has relationships with rock and soil, microbes, beavers, humans. And so it's going to find its path through a landscape. And we see this in a variety of ways. People who work in water have a joke about levees, that there are two kinds of levees, ones that have failed and ones that are going to fail. And there are various hydrological reasons for that. But we also see this, a lot of these wetlands that are filled in and then built upon, they frequently flood. The water remembers, the water still goes where the water wants to go. And that's why a lot of people in my book, who I call water detectives, and these are engineers, ecologists, landscape architects, urban planners, they do something first called historical ecology. And the idea behind that is to try to map what water did in their area before we subverted it. So, most cities, 75 some odd percent of their streams have been buried, filled in, or, put in a pipe, put underground. Vast majority around the world, 87% of islands have been filled in or drained. And so in all these ways, we've dramatically interfered with the water cycle, and we're just not giving it enough space to do its thing. And so one of the main ideas in the book is that, we're seeing droughts and floods, really epic droughts and floods almost every day in the news somewhere around the world. 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater earlier this year. But, it's not just climate change causing these extremes. It's also our development choices. And that is urban sprawl, industrial agriculture, and the very concrete hard infrastructure way that we're trying to control water. And I increasingly see acknowledgement that climate change is water change, that climate change has a role in these water extremes. But the narrative tends to be like, well, our infrastructure wasn't designed for these extremes. And that's true, but acknowledging the fact that the infrastructure, in fact, is a big part of the problem. When we're maximizing these systems like for human benefit and trying to get the absolute most efficiency, we're not giving space for the natural system to function. And in all of these ways in which we've taken away space from water, water is going to take back its space when it needs it. And that's why the title is Water Always Wins. But if we can proactively return space to water, restore wetlands, floodplains, forests, mountain meadows, all of these really critical facets of the water cycle, and most importantly, heal the surface groundwater relationship, which, people to a large degree haven't understood groundwater, and so they've exploited it and not, taken it for granted and not understood how critical it is to, in fact, supplying water in the dry season, for example. And so that's another big piece of it. So all of these people around the world, including in the San Francisco Bay, where they're restoring these tidal marshes, are looking for ways to return space to water and to let water return to its slow phases, to slow on the land. And there are various kind of aspects to the Slow Water Manifesto, which are that it is unique to each place, seeking to work with the local ecology, geology, the local culture, rather than control it. And it can't be a cookie cutter approach. It has to work with that particular place and give that system room to function. Rather than taking a kind of arrogant, control-oriented approach to water, treating water with respect as an entity with agency and trying to understand the relationship that it has with all of the different entities and how those help keep the system functioning for other beings and also for humans. So with that kind of leads to systems thinking rather than like linear, single focus problem solving. Ideally local, working within an area's local water means. I should add that kind of the standard approach to water, it causes a lot of environmental justice issues. Like when we need water, we tend to think, oh, we'll build a dam and we'll bring it from somewhere else. But there was a big meta study over 40 years that found that big dams on rivers brought water to 20% of the world's population, but decreased water availability to 24% of the world's population. And similarly, levees, if you protect one area, you're just raising the water in the river higher, which increases the flooding risk for another area that maybe where people live who can't afford a levee, for example. These slow water approaches are distributed across the landscape rather than centralized. And the idea behind that is like, if you think of that 87% of the world's wetlands that we've eradicated, you understand why we need to look for spaces to restore for water all along its path. And the good news about many small projects is that it allows us a little more flexibility to build a project or create space for water in this small area where we can. And it's scalable, in the same way that solar panels on everyone's roof ultimately adds up to a lot of electricity. Small projects scattered across the landscape ultimately add up to a significant ability to absorb floodwaters and then also supply water in the dry season. Because the ways in which that we try to constrain water and straighten it out, we're creating all this fast water and we're rushing it off the landscape. And there's so many important things that can't happen, like the sediment dispersal that I'm talking about, or support for ecosystems. Rivers have a hidden gut, a microbiome underneath them. So, there's like a secret river under the river where all kinds of important biological and chemical processing happens for supporting all forms of life, for breaking down chemical pollution. So if that is scoured away and missing, it's not working. These systems are so complex, and so many of our interventions ignore that. And so that's why I say that we're just creating a lot of these problems that we're suffering right now.
For the book, where else did you go reporting, and what did you find? What were some of the more promising or really smart ways of restoring some of the way that water naturally functions in the landscape? And what are some of the best ways you've come across of building infrastructure for humans that helps both humans live and works in concert well with the water environment?
There are a lot of examples in the book. I tried to find places that represented nearly every continent, and so that there would be different cultures, different landscapes, and different water issues, both scarcity and flooding, loss of glaciers and snowpack. And the idea behind that was so that anyone could read it and find somebody doing something that might give them ideas for their own place to address the problems that they were having with water in their own place. So, I went to Iraq, to the Mesopotamian wetlands, which was absolutely incredible. There are people living on top of the wetlands in a way that people have been living for 9,000 years. This predates the Sumerian civilization. The Sumerian civilization arose out of this culture after it had been in existence for 3,000 years. And so these are people who have figured out, in modern development, wetlands, still are seen as wastelands. And so we want to drain them. We want to create land. We want to build something on them or plant something on them. These folks are living on top of the wetlands. They use reeds that grow, a noble resource for their homes, for their animal paddocks. They fish, they raise water buffalo for milk and cheese, and then they trade with people on land for vegetables and things like that. And so it's this really interesting example of just a radically different way of looking at wetlands. That's not to suggest that people elsewhere are going to start doing that where they aren't doing it now. But I put it in the book because I felt like it helps us to kind of question our presumptions about what wetlands are and what they can be. And, it's an incredibly rich environment that does provide almost everything that they need. Let's see. I went to England and then also Washington State to look at beavers. So in England, people are using beavers to prevent flooding, which is a little counterintuitive. People tend to think that beavers cause flooding, but in fact, they slow water. They slow water on the land. And so if you have a big flood coming, the water is going to move down the river more slowly over a longer period of time. So you're not going to have the same height of flood peak. And with climate change, a lot of ancient or really old towns along streams in the UK are flooding more and more often. And so beavers were completely eradicated, killed from that area 400 years ago, and now they're coming back. In Washington, they're using beavers as kind of a replacement for snowpack to store water on the land. There have been some studies that show that within 1 year of beavers being relocated to an area, they are storing 75 times more water above and below the surface than on 100 meters of stream without beavers. And it's also an important fire break because beaver ponds, obviously water doesn't burn, but they're also raising the water table across a wider area. And so the vegetation has more access to that, less flammable. Elsewhere in California, there are geologists who are looking for this really cool geological feature crafted by ancient rivers called paleo valleys. These were created during the last ice age, and they're basically super porous channels just under the surface where you can take the huge rains that are coming with these atmospheric river storms and infiltrate it into the quickly so that you have it stored later. And there are big problems in California with overpumping groundwater, and that means that there's less water available on the surface during the dry season. People tend to think of groundwater and surface water as separate, but they are linked by gravity and hydraulic pressure. So if you have a groundwater table that has fallen, it's no longer able to supply that surface water from below. So in the West, we tend to think of streams as only running during the winter, but in fact, a lot of them used to run year round. I went to Peru and India, where I saw people who are rehabilitating ancient human water management systems. In both cases, those areas only got water part of the year with the monsoon in India, and then the Peruvian Andes have a climate sort of like California, where you get a lot of rain within a few months and then no rain the rest of the year. And in both places, people innovated really amazing, ingenious systems of moving the water, slowing the water on the land, moving it underground so that then it would travel more slowly and be available to them throughout the year. And both of those cultures are really fascinating. In Kenya, there is a national agency that is the Water Towers Authority. So the vast majority of water in Kenya used by people comes from these very high mountains. And they've had problems there with deforestation and also like unsustainable agricultural practices. And so people have been investing in people there to change those practices and to restore those water towers. There are some really interesting national policies too. Like Peru has a national law that requires water utilities to invest in nature as part of the water infrastructure. China has a national cities plan, which looks for ways to infiltrate water within the city. That's a big problem. The land area covered by cities has doubled globally just by since 1992. So that's why we're seeing cities flooding so much more often, and also why that water isn't available in the dry season, because when the city floods, then we try to rush it away, and then we don't have that water later. I could go on, but I think I'm rambling.
No, right on. It's great. If I was curious to ask you, how are the people in Iraq living on or near the marshes doing? Because I recall a while ago reading that one of the worst crimes of Saddam Hussein was destroying the marshlands in Iraq.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
what's happened there?
Yeah, it was for people who don't know. Basically, some people that Saddam viewed as his enemies were hiding in the marshes, and so as a retaliation, he built a bunch of levees to block the water's access to the marshes, and basically dried out 95% of them or something. And those people who had lived the water for many, many generations were refugees, uh, into places like Babylon and Baghdad. And I should add that some scientists think that the Mesopotamian marshes were actually the Garden of Eden. So
Yeah, it
anyway,
sounds
after
plausible.
Saddam fell, Yeah, after Saddam fell, basically the marsh dwellers went back. They broke up in the levees and the water returned. And it was kind of a very low tech, just add water approach to restoration. Um, these Martians have had a lot of experience with that. Countless civilizations have come and gone in this area, and some of them have done a lot of irrigation and diverted water from the marshes. But then the civilization would fall, their infrastructure would collapse, and the water would return to the marshes, and the marshes would be restored. And in the case of Saddam's attack, there's another marsh that is largely in Iran that is part of the system. And he did not damage that one because it would have political consequences that he didn't want. And so that allowed a lot of the other forms of life that lived in that marsh to be able to return to these restored marshes once there was water there again. But these people are facing ongoing challenges because of all of the upstream dams. In particular, Turkey has been on a massive dam building spree over the last few decades because they have a kind of dry area in the southeast that they're trying to turn into an agricultural heartland. And so that means a lot less water is going into the marshes. And in fact, one of the marshes that I saw when I was there is dry now. It's the central marsh that still has water. There just isn't really enough water to fill the whole area anymore. And with sea level rise, water is coming, salt water is coming upstream from the Gulf. And when there was a lot of water in the marshes, that would flush that water out continually. But with less water coming because of these dam diversions, that's happening less. And so also with sea level rise, like the city of Basra has had a lot of violence and protests because the water they're getting out of their taps is salty now. Not all the time, but some of the time. And, countries like Turkey refuse to have transboundary discussions about water. That to their mind, the rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, originate in Turkey, and so therefore they're going to take what they want.
Can you tell us any more interesting tidbits or anecdotes or ideas that, for whatever reason, they didn't end up making it in your book? You had to cut them for whatever reason.
Oh, so many. I think I'll tell you one other that is in my book that I didn't mention yet, which is the
Sure.
final chapter deals with stepping back, sometimes called managed retreat. And that has been sort of anathema to this dominant culture idea of controlling nature. But there are places where arguably we shouldn't be living that are going to flood repeatedly and more often, both along the coast and along rivers. And so there's a question of how many times do we want to try to rebuild in the same place? And would that money be better spent, planning to move somewhere else, working with the community to move back together, to move toward something better? And a lot of people are working on that. And I talk about some of their work in the book. And it can be targeted as well. So, there are studies showing that there's a lot of marginal farmland in the world that people are kind of stepping back from. And in some places, if you look at that historical ecology picture of where water wanted to go, you can see this was a floodplain. And if we return this land that isn't terribly important to people right now, then that's going to protect all these other people downstream. And so there are a lot of approaches like that, that if you think strategically throughout a watershed, you can make kind of wiser decisions. And then there's one person in my book who is a proponent of amphibious architecture. So the idea here is that when the water comes, the building rises with the water. And so instead of trying to keep water out, you're accepting that water is going to come, and you have adapted so that you can ride that out. The water is actually lifting the home to safety, so that it doesn't flood. And there are different ways to do that in different parts of the world. And it may not work in a place where the water is really rough. Like maybe it's not going to work on an ocean in a hurricane, but it can work in some places. And it's another potential way for us to figure out how to live with water and give it the space that it needs, and that if we don't give it, it will take.
What are you working on now at the moment, now that you've got the book done?
I'm doing a lot of talks related to the book. A lot of people seem interested in this approach, and particularly like a lot of water associations and government agencies and things like that, utilities. So that's encouraging. And then I've been doing some more reporting. I did a story recently for a Canadian publication called The Narwhal, and I think a lot of Americans don't realize this, but British Columbia had a massive flood about a year ago, November, that flooded towns, farmland, people died, hundreds of thousands of livestock died, roads and railways were cut off for weeks, which had a big impact on supply chains in Canada. And so the government now is going through a kind of a build back better approach. How are we going to prevent this from happening again? And interestingly, this area that they were farming in and living in, that they are living and farming in, was a lake 100 years ago. It was a lake that was a very important food resource for the First Nations who lived there. And the settlers came and they thought, this water shouldn't be on this good land, like let's drain it and let's make it farmland. And so that's been sort of unquestioned for a long time, but there's rivers that flow through that area in addition to the lake. There's a pumping facility that runs almost all the time to keep the water out of the lake, to keep it from refilling, as well as like tons of levees and floodgates and things like that. And both Canada and British Columbia have signed on to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that's not just that Indigenous people should be consulted when you're doing projects, but really co-governance. And I think people don't exactly know what that means or what that's going to look like. But there have been conversations with First Nations who are from that area, and they did not live close to the lake. They understood that the lake ebbed and flowed. They would spend a lot of time by the lake, but their permanent settlements weren't there. They were higher up. And so they're concerned about the health of some other relations theirs that are struggling with this very engineered system. So the story was basically looking at to what extent are the British Columbia and Canadian government listening to these other ideas about how to practice slow water and live in a more flexible space with water. And to what extent are they sort of going ahead with the build back bigger, which is often the instinct of the dominant culture.
Nice. So you've had some really encouraging feedback and interest from people who do have the influence and the power to implement some of these more sensible strategies around water since the publication of your book?
Yeah, there's been a lot of interest. I mean, I think it's early to say that, people are changing their ways, but I do feel like, I'm a journalist and I'm documenting what people around the world are already doing. And I think, this idea of land use change is really important for climate change, and it's barely getting any attention. 25% of our emissions come from land use change. And these water projects are, wetlands store more carbon dioxide than a lot of forests. So it's not just climate adaptation, making yourself more resilient, it's also actually reducing climate change. So, I'm hopeful that these ideas will gain more widespread understanding, like people understanding that they exist and then also that they work. Like, because I think a lot of people think, oh, nature-based solutions are nice, but they're not going to be a significant part of the solution. We have to control things. But in fact, it's really a question of scale. If you think about that 87% of the world's wetlands that we've eradicated, the scale of space that we need to return to water is pretty significant. And the places in my book are trying to take the scale across Peru, across California, across China, across Kenya. So, it's starting to happen. The body of scientific data showing that these things work is growing. The Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act had a fairly good chunk of money. I don't want to cite it because I don't remember off the top of my head. That was, they were kind of touting it as for nature-based solutions, but if you read the fine print of the policy, nature-based solutions were one possibility that money could go to. So, and that depends on a local government agency or entity proposing that project and asking for that money for that thing. So that means that pot of money is only going to go to nature-based solutions if people are aware that they can use nature-based solutions and if they understand and appreciate them. I'll just add that, like, a lot of our cost benefit analysis in the dominant culture is very focused on one thing. Like, we want to prevent flooding. Does this thing prevent flooding? We want more water. Does the solution bring more water? But these slow water projects have many benefits. They can simultaneously prevent flooding and drought. They store carbon dioxide. They are habitat for biodiversity that we are also pushing to the brink. They redistribute soil and sediment, leading to less erosion. They reduce the need for irrigation and fertilizer. I could go on and on. So that's another thing that I try to emphasize when I'm talking to people about this is, like, if you're doing your cost benefit analysis, there are all of these other benefits that you can add into the tally sheet that are also things that we need to do. And most important, like, when you take that systems lens to your problem solving, if your system is healthy and functioning well, then it can maintain itself to a large degree, which ends up saving a lot of money. And in fact, so much of the science that people are doing does show that these types of interventions are incredibly cost effective.
Once again, the book is Water Always Wins. And sounds like if we realize that, humans can win too. Before we go, do you want to tell our viewers where they can find you online? Are you on social media? Do you have a website people can check out?
Yeah. So the book's website is slowwater.world. And there are other interviews with me there. Of course, none can match this one. And that book website is linked to my my broader work website, which is my name, ericagies.com. And I think you can find my Twitter link there. Yeah, I'm not hard to find. eGuys on Twitter,
Right.
EHGuys on Instagram.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time, Erica. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It was fun.